By November 1918, intelligence estimated that some 692 of these monstrous siege howitzers remained in British service, scattered across gun parks and battery positions from Flanders to the Rhine bridgeheads. They had fired more than 3 million rounds of high explosive during the war, earning a reputation as the most feared counter-battery weapon on the Western Front. Now, with the guns falling silent, an entirely different question presented itself. What does an empire do with hundreds of obsolete siege weapons once the war that justified them has ended? The 9.2-inch howitzer had begun life almost as an experiment. A single prototype, nicknamed Mother by the men who served it, fired its first round in action on 31st October 1914, and within weeks it had been inspected by Field Marshal Sir John French and visited by the Prince of Wales himself. So unusual was this new class of heavy ordnance. 16 production examples were ordered almost immediately, followed by 16 more within the month. By the time the armistice was signed at Compiègne, the design had matured through two principal marks. The improved Mark II entering service in December 1916 with a longer barrel and a range extended to nearly 14,000 yards. What had started as a curiosity had become the backbone of British siege artillery, equipping dozens of batteries of the Royal Garrison Artillery, and by 1918, batteries crewed by Australian, Canadian, and American gunners as well. Peace brought no immediate certainty about the future of this weapon. Whilst German technology captured on the battlefield was subject to demolition and confiscation under the disarmament terms soon to be codified at Versailles, Britain's own howitzers faced a different and in some ways more mundane fate: the brutal arithmetic of post-war economy. An empire exhausted by 4 years of total war, staring down enormous debts and a public mood demanding retrenchment, could not simply keep hundreds of 14-ton siege pieces standing idle in French fields. The guns that had helped win the war were about to become a liability that someone would have to pay to store, maintain, or dispose of. The situation at war's end was one of extraordinary scale and disorder. Batteries were found still emplaced around Cambrai, Ypres, and along the Hindenburg Line, some freshly relocated during the final 100 Days offensive, others having barely fired a shot before the guns stopped. Some equipments were in near pristine condition, having only recently left the Vickers or Coventry Ordnance Works production lines. Others were worn nearly smooth in the bore after years of continuous fire, their recoil systems leaking hydraulic fluid, their platforms sunk deep into churned Flanders mud. Transport alone posed a formidable challenge, since each howitzer required 3 separate loads. Its body and cradle, its bed, and its barrel moved on purpose-built wagons that were themselves in short supply as the army demobilized around them. Depots at Le Havre, Calais, and the Channel ports filled with dismantled ordnance awaiting shipment home, whilst officers of the Ordnance Directorate debated which examples merited retention, which should be sold as scrap, and which, if any, deserved a place in the nation's memory. Unlike the German equipment being catalogued and confiscated under the Inter-Allied Control Commission a few hundred miles to the east, these were British-built weapons, crewed by British, Australian, Canadian, and American gunners alike, and there was no treaty clause compelling their destruction. That absence of legal obligation made the decisions that followed feel in some ways more arbitrary and more painful for the men who had served the guns. A weapon judged too expensive to ship home might simply be abandoned where it stood, whilst one earmarked for a training establishment might survive for another 2 decades. The debate that mattered here was not disarmament, but economy. Whether the Treasury could justify the cost of shipping, storing, and maintaining several hundred 14-ton siege pieces at a moment when the entire machinery of the wartime state was being dismantled around them. Subscribe if you're enjoying this look at the quieter, less discussed side of the Great War's aftermath. Britain's own handling of the howitzers fell to the War Office and its newly formed Disposal and Liquidation Commission, tasked with converting the vast surplus of the wartime army into cash or usable stock for a peacetime force. Roughly 200 examples were earmarked for retention, distributed amongst training establishments at Larkhill and Shoeburyness, where Mother herself, the original prototype, was fired until she was quite worn out and finally retired to storage. The remainder, several hundred equipments scattered across France and Belgium, were assessed for repatriation, and by the autumn of 1919, shipping priority had shifted overwhelmingly towards men rather than machinery, meaning many howitzers sat abandoned in French depots for a year or more before anyone arranged their return. Those that did come home were often sold at public auction as scrap steel, their barrels cut for furnace stock at a time when the iron and steel trade desperately needed raw material for reconstruction. Some carriages, stripped of their valuable bronze and brass fittings, were left to rust in ordnance yards at Woolwich and Chilwell. Their fate, a matter of bureaucratic indifference rather than deliberate policy. Canada's contribution to the 9.2-inch howitzer story ran through the Canadian Corps' heavy artillery groups, whose gunners had crewed British-supplied equipments throughout the war's final campaigns. When the Corps demobilized through 1919, Canadian authorities showed considerably less appetite than the British for retaining such heavy siege pieces, given Canada's small standing peacetime garrison requirements, and the great majority of Canadian crewed howitzers were simply returned to British ordnance control rather than shipped across the Atlantic. A handful were retained as instructional pieces at Canadian artillery schools and later found their way into militia armories, whilst the bulk rejoined the general pool of surplus equipment awaiting disposal in France. Australia's imperial force followed a broadly similar pattern, though with one important difference: a deliberate program of returning selected weapons as war trophies for Australian towns and cities, a practice that saw field guns, howitzers, and captured German ordnance alike shipped home to stand in parks and outside town halls as permanent memorials. Whilst the majority of trophy guns distributed to Australian municipalities were captured German pieces rather than British-built 9.2-inch howitzers, at least a small number of the latter were secured through the Australian War Records section for eventual display, reflecting the strong sentiment amongst returning servicemen that the guns which had supported their advances at Villers-Bretonneux and Mont-Saint-Quentin deserved to be remembered rather than melted down. The American Expeditionary Force's experience differed again. American heavy artillery units had trained on and operated British-supplied 9.2-inch howitzers during 1918, since American industry had not produced its own equivalent siege piece in time for the war's end. Once hostilities ceased, the United States Army had little interest in retaining foreign ordnance for which no domestic ammunition supply chain existed, and virtually all American crewed examples were returned to British stocks in France during the demobilization of 1919. A small number were shipped to the United States for technical evaluation by the Ordnance Department at Aberdeen Proving Ground, where engineers studied the Vickers-designed recoil mechanism and Whelan breech system for lessons applicable to future American heavy artillery development, though the howitzer itself was never adopted for American service. Disposal, once the decision had been made, proceeded with the same brisk economy that characterized so much of Britain's post-war demobilization. The Ministry of Munitions, working alongside the Disposal Board, oversaw the sale of hundreds of complete equipments and spare barrels to scrap metal contractors through 1920 and 1921, a period when the collapse in post-war metal prices meant the government often recovered only a fraction of the gun's original manufacturing cost. Steelworks in South Wales and the Midlands absorbed much of this material, feeding a domestic industry hungry for recycled ordnance-grade steel during the difficult transition to peacetime production. Some carriages were simply broken up on site in France rather than shipped home at all, the cost of transport judged not worth the residual scrap value. Ammunition stocks, running into the low millions of unfired 290-pound high explosive shells, presented their own hazard, and considerable quantities were disposed of through controlled demolition at ranges such as Shoeburyness, where obsolete shell had long been destroyed under controlled conditions rather than risk deterioration in storage. By the mid-1920s, the overwhelming majority, probably in excess of 4/5 of the wartime total, had been scrapped, sold, or expended, leaving only a modest retained establishment for training and a scattering of memorial pieces. What survived did so for a mixture of reasons: sentiment, training utility, and simple bureaucratic inertia. The retained training equipments at Larkhill and Shoeburyness formed the nucleus of the interwar Royal Artillery's heavy howitzer expertise, and it was from this small surviving pool that a limited number were returned to active service with British forces during the Battle of France in 1940, a startling reappearance of Great War ordnance in an entirely different conflict, before the remainder were withdrawn to home defense duties for the rest of the Second World War. The original Mother prototype barrel survives today, mounted on a Mark I carriage, and is preserved by the Imperial War Museum in London, one of the most recognizable single artifacts of British siege artillery anywhere in the world. Further examples can be found at the Royal Artillery Historical Trust's collection, now based at Larkhill, whilst the Australian War Memorial in Canberra holds artillery pieces from the same family of ordnance amongst its trophy collection. The Baseboard and Military Museum in Canada and several regimental museums across the Commonwealth retain component parts, breech mechanisms, and instructional sections rather than complete equipments, a reflection of how thoroughly the bulk of the type was broken up rather than preserved whole. Restoration of what does survive has been a slow and painstaking business. Decades in outdoor storage left many retained carriages badly corroded, their hydro-pneumatic recoil cylinders long since drained and seized, and volunteers working with regimental trusts have spent years tracking down replacement gauges, sighting equipment, and small fittings that were removed and lost during the original scrapping drives of the 1920s. Complete, correctly matched equipments, barrel, cradle, and bed, all from the same mark and in original condition, are now exceptionally rare, since so many surviving barrels were paired with mismatched carriages during the years when spare parts were simply cannibalized from whatever stock remained in ordnance depots. Occasional battlefield finds still surface, buried gun pits and collapsed emplacements along the old Western Front, occasionally yielding fragments of breech mechanisms or carriage ironwork, though a complete recovered equipment has not emerged from French or Belgian soil in living memory. What remains today, then, is a handful of static, largely immobile survivors, valued as much for their rarity as for their engineering, each one representing perhaps 1 in 300 of the guns that stood ready along the front when the armistice was signed. The 9.2-inch Howitzer's technical legacy outlived the guns themselves. Its Welland breech block and hydro-pneumatic recoil system, refined across 2 marks under wartime pressure, informed the design thinking behind Britain's later BL 7.2-inch howitzer of the Second World War, itself created in the early 1940s by reboring worn 8-inch barrels along similar principles. The weapon's central place in the Royal Artillery's own self-image is perhaps best captured by its selection as the symbolic gun depicted on the Royal Artillery Memorial at Hyde Park Corner, unveiled in 1925, a permanent monument choosing this weapon above all others to represent the gunner's war. That such an iconic and feared piece of equipment could nonetheless be reduced, within barely a decade, from 692 examples to a bare handful of survivors, says a great deal about how quickly even the most formidable wartime technology can vanish once its usefulness has passed. It began as a single experimental barrel tested in the Welsh hills at Rhyadr in the summer of 1914, and within 4 years it had become the weapon chosen to represent an entire arm of the British Army in bronze at Hyde Park Corner. Most of the 692 howitzers that saw the armistice were gone within a decade, cut up for scrap steel or expended on the ranges, and only a scattered handful, headed by Mother herself, remain to be seen today. If you found this video insightful, watch what happened to Britain's captured German heavy artillery after World War I next. It explores how thousands of enemy guns seized along the retreating front were catalogued, tested, distributed as war trophies to towns across Britain and the Commonwealth, and, in most cases, quietly melted down within a generation. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more. Thanks for watching.